From an R-rated animated comedy that scarred everyone, to his disappointing duet with Barbra Streisand, here are some of the worst Seth Rogen movies of all time, starting with 2016's Sausage Party. It's fair to say that the R rating for this animated movie was well-deserved. It tells the story of a sausage as he goes on a trip through the supermarket and learns more about himself and his true purpose along the way. The truth shows a dark secret, and he sets out to tell his fellow products about it as a way to rebel against the humans who buy them. This movie is silly, insulting, and kinda weird. It's right up your alley if you like slapstick and dirty jokes. As for the cast, Rogen voices the lead sausage. James Franco, Salma Hayek, Michael Cera, Jonah Hill, Danny McBride, Paul Rudd, and Kristen Wiig voice the other grocery store items. This bizarre comedy is the perfect example of a cringe comedy, so tighten your seatbelt and get ready for some pretty gross imagery, deaths, and innuendos. But more importantly, prepare to never want to eat sausages ever again. As for its box office progress, the movie did well at the box office and showed off Rogen's sense of humor perfectly, but critics didn't like it as much. Fans loved it though. This reminds me of another Rogen flick that didn't receive good reception from the critics, nor the fans in this case. Yep, it's none other than 2012's For a Good Time Call. While there are a lot of creative ways to make money for rent, starting a phone sex line is probably not one of the best, but all things considered, the movie was, at best, a basic average comedy. It starred Rogen's wife, Lauren Miller Rogen, and Ari Grainer, as two people who used to be enemies, but now live together in an apartment they can't afford. I can already imagine how uncomfortable that must be. So where does Seth Rogen come in? Well, Seth has a small part in the movie as Captain Jerry, but even though the movie didn't get good marks, Grainer and Lauren Miller Rogen gave great performances. Speaking of great performances, who remembers 2009's Monsters vs. Aliens?
Hold on a second. We have to get off the bridge before...
It's fair to say that Rogen has one of the most unique and almost recognizable voices in Hollywood. But despite that, he hasn't been able to use it in too many movies. And just to be clear, Rogen has been in a number of animated movies. But in many of them, like Kung Fu Panda, he has a very small part or doesn't get to show off his full range of talents. That leaves us with Monsters vs. Aliens, which is one of the least impressive animated movies of the past few years. It's funny and promising idea doesn't get to shine, while Rogen's voice acting doesn't get to shine either. And as the voice of B.O.B., a one-eyed slime ball who can twist and turn himself in different ways,
Oh, I forgot how to breathe. Don't know how to breathe. Help me, Dr. Cockroach, help!
Rogen is at least one of the highlights of the movie. He gets some of the biggest laughs and brings his likable, goofy charm to the animated part. But in the end, overall, it's just an okay movie that doesn't do much to live up to its promise, though it still gave Seth Rogen a chance to try out animation and family-friendly entertainment. But what can I say? It's still a bust. You can tell Seth Rogen tends to fail more often than he wins when he goes outside of his R-rated comfort zone, as this list shows. The actor also likes to try out different genres and tones in different projects, but the ones that get PG or PG-13 grades tend to be the ones that don't work. So it's clear that The Green Hornet was an ambitious but underwhelming effort by the actor, writer, and director. He was trying to make himself into a blockbuster because of his big personality, but despite his best efforts, he didn't get the superhero formula right, and in the end, Sony's superhero reboot project wasn't all that great. As for the movie, Rogen wrote and acted in this new take on the masked crime fighter. He also tried to put his lighthearted charm into this silly, good-natured take on the material, but it felt half-hearted in a way that most Seth Rogen movies, whether they're good or not, don't. And with a confusing mix of tones and comedic styles, he made a rare mistake that isn't so much bad as just mediocre, which in a lot of ways makes it way worse. But The Green Hornet's failure taught Rogan and Evan Goldberg a very important lesson that they continued to use in their later work, which is it's better to take risks with a lower budget than to try to meet standards for a big budget. Now, while I'm talking about Rogan's Sony projects, how can I forget Neighbors 2 Sorority Rising? But here's the thing. Sorority Rising is like most sequels in a way that it's not as good as the first one. Set 2 years after the first movie, it follows Rogan and Rose Byrne as they try to sell their house and deal with a new sorority. How original. And obviously, in this case, the movie was almost an exact copy of the first one, while not adding anything new or exciting. But even though the movie wasn't Rogan's best, it did very well at the box office, which is surprising if you ask me. Now moving on to the next one. You, Me, and Dupree was another forgettable comedy that starred the man himself. The Holiday and She's the Man were two pretty popular romantic comedies that came out in 2006. But unfortunately, You, Me, and Dupree wasn't one of them. The story revolves around Carl, played by Matt Dillon, and Molly, played by Kate Hudson, who just got married, and their friend Randolph Dupree, played by Owen Wilson, who they can't get rid of. As for Rogan's part, he plays Carl's friend. It was a pretty small role and, in the end, easy to forget.
And the script was really funny, so I think that's what's funny about it, though, I think, is that it's a comedy about this relationship.
But even though critics didn't like the movie, it did very well at the box office. But what's more surprising is that it was directed by the now famous Russo brothers. Yep, the same duo who went on to direct Avengers: Infinity War. Now, before I end this video, let's talk about his duet with Barbra Streisand.
It is a different kind of love story. It's a love story between a mother and a child.
Even though The Guilt Trip was mostly kind and funny, it's not too different from some of Rogan's better works.
My mother's an old friend of your father's, and I thought you were, it doesn't make a difference. Could you help us get in touch with your father, please?
But The Guilt Trip is too sweet and sentimental in a way that most Rogan movies try to avoid.
I dated your father for a while, before he met your mother.
Really?
Yeah.
And the result is something you don't usually get from a Seth Rogan movie. A boring, bland, and ultimately average effort with no character or personality to make it stand out or succeed. But even though it's nice to have a Seth Rogan movie that you can take your grandma to without feeling weird, The Guilt Trip was a huge disappointment. It lacks any kind of uniqueness or visual style.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Hi. I didn't realize you had company.
Hi.
No, that's okay. These are old friends of Dad's. This is my sister.
But it does have a good heart when it needs to. And even though Rogan and Barbra Streisand have a nice on-screen chemistry that gives some of the dull comedy a bit of a kick, it's still not enough to make the movie worth seeing. The result is a disappointing and unsuccessful comedy that is easy to watch but doesn't leave much to think about. And with that being said, Rogan's had his fair share of flops. But hey, we love him anyway. And that's all from my end on Seth Rogan's worst movies of all time.
A mother and a son who don't have a great relationship, and they go on this road trip together, and they get to know each other better, basically.